Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Ali and let's talk about finance. In today's video, we're going to be talking about probate, what exactly it is and how it could actually impact you and your family after you pass away. So let's get started. Now remember, this is not legal advice. If you have any questions with regards to the probate process and your specific situation, talk to a professional. So what exactly is probate? So probate is essentially the process in which you have to go through to validate your will. Now this process starts after you pass away. Essentially what will happen is your executor will start the process of getting the will validated through the probate process. Now what ends up happening once you go through the probate process, not only does your will get validated, but the executor is given legal authority to distribute your assets based on how you have it written out in the will. So this is a very, very important process that you have to go through. Most people in Canada do go through this process. Not everybody actually has to though, and not everybody will go through this process. And I'll explain why in just a little bit. So probate really is a legal process that you have to go through. A lot of times it goes through the provincial courts. Every single province has its own process in which you have to follow. Here in Ontario, you have to go through the provincial court. And essentially, when you go through that process, not only does it validate the will and give your executor authority to distribute your assets based on your will, there's also a fee that's associated with it. It's what they call a probate fee. It's very similar to an estate tax, but they don't want to call it an estate tax just because it's the government and they don't really want to make it seem like there's another tax. It really is another tax if you really think about it. Now, there's a couple of things though to keep in mind. The probate process, even if you don't have a will, you might still have to go through it. And the reason for that is because when you don't have a will, you may still have assets that need to be distributed amongst your next of kin or your spouse if you have a spouse at the time of passing away. Now, with that being said, this whole process can get a little bit complicated when it comes to actually going through it, especially if you're planning on doing it by yourself. Now, most people will go through the probate process with a lawyer, and it's just because it becomes a lot easier to deal with by going through a lawyer. Now, the only thing to keep in mind is with that, of course, with lawyers come lawyer fees, and that could come at a little bit of a cost depending on which lawyer you're using, as well as how big your estate is, because some lawyers will actually charge you more if you have a bigger estate. Now, with that being said, you can actually go through the probate process yourself. You could complete all the paperwork yourself. You can apply for probate by yourself as long as you have all of the paperwork taken care of. So this process doesn't necessarily need a lawyer, but like I said, a lot of people use lawyer because it makes it a little bit easier on themselves. Now, who's the person that's responsible for starting the probate process? If you have a will, a lot of times it's the executor of the will that starts that process because they're the ones that are responsible for taking care of your estate. Now, if you don't have a will, then the person that's going to be taking care of the probate process will most likely be a spouse or common law partner. If you don't have a spouse or common law partner, then potentially if you have any kids, your kids could potentially start that process. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are probate fees. I'm gonna explain how these probate fees work. Now, every single province has a different process when it comes to the probate fees. Probate fees are essentially estate taxes. The government's not going to say that it's estate taxes, but that's really what it is. The way that probate fees are calculated here in Ontario is you don't pay any probate fees for the first $50,000 of your estate. Essentially, it's 1.5% for anything above $50,000. Not all of your assets are going to be included in the probate fees. Anything that has a beneficiary is not included in the probate fees. Anything that's jointly owned is not going to be included in the probate fees. So anything that's essentially owned individually and does not have a beneficiary will be included when calculating the probate fees. So let's go through an example. Say there's a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. They have about $3 million worth of assets combined between their home, their cottage, their vehicles, their retirement accounts, as well as some savings and some other assets as well. So let's say Mr. Smith passes away. What has to go through probate? So first of all, the house is jointly owned, the cottage is jointly owned, the vehicles are jointly owned, and they have some joint savings accounts and joint bank accounts. The retirement accounts are individually owned by Mr. Smith, and then Mrs. Smith has her own retirement accounts. What ends up happening here? The house and the cottage are jointly owned, so essentially what will happen is these will automatically transfer over, so then they could be individually owned by Mrs. Smith. The vehicle is going to be the same thing. as well as the savings accounts and the bank accounts that are jointly owned. Now they're all going to be individually held by Mrs. Smith. Now what's going to happen with the retirement accounts? So the retirement accounts, a lot of times there are beneficiaries. Those a lot of times will just roll over to Mrs. Smith, and ultimately that leaves next to nothing that is left for the estate. So essentially in this case, no probate fees are going to be paid for Mr. Smith's estate. A couple years later, Mrs. Smith passes away. Now let's take a look and see what is going to be included in probate. So in this case, she has the house, she has the cottage, she has a vehicle, she has a bank account and savings accounts. She also has her retirement accounts. As mentioned before, the retirement accounts will have a beneficiary on file. If there is no beneficiary and the beneficiary is the estate, then it has to go through the probate process. Anytime it's not an actual person that's named as the beneficiary, it has to go through the probate process. However, in most cases, people will have somebody named as a beneficiary. Those retirement accounts do not have to go through the probate process. Now, let's take a look and see what happens with the house, with the cottage, with the vehicles, as well as the bank accounts and savings accounts that are individually owned by Mrs. Smith. So let's say altogether, all of these assets that are individually owned that don't have beneficiaries attached to them come to about $2 million. The first $50,000, you don't have to pay any probate fees, but any amount above that $50,000, you have to pay 1.5% or $15 on every $1,000 above that threshold. So in this case, of the $2 million, $1,950,000 you have to pay probate fees on. And with that 1.5% on that 1.95 million, you're looking at $29,250 that has to be paid by the estate for probate fees. Now keep in mind, this is only probate fees. This does not cover any sort of income taxes that are owed on the final tax return. So obviously seeing this, you can see that the probate fees can add up pretty quickly. And a lot of people are looking for ways to reduce the probate fees. And here are a couple things to keep in mind. One is if you have any accounts that you can designate a beneficiary, make sure you do it. If you do that, then the money is going to bypass probate, so then you don't have to pay probate fees for that. Another thing to keep in mind is anything that, like I said, is jointly owned is going to pass on to the other owner, assuming that the setup of the joint ownership is joint ownership with right of survivorship. Of course, if the joint ownership is set up without right of survivorship, then that's a completely different situation. That would still have to be dealt with through the probate process. So with that being said, if you have the ability to make an asset joint, you can definitely do that. There are some things though to be a little cautious of from a legal perspective, whether it's from a creditor protection perspective, whether it opens you up to a little bit extra risk. These are all things that you have to consider before you actually go and do that. It might actually be worth paying a little bit for probate fees rather than opening up yourself to risk if the person that you're thinking of adding as a joint owner may not be the most financially savvy or has been in a little bit of trouble, because that could, like I said, open you up to a little bit of risk. If you're watching this video and now you're thinking, okay, what do I do then in this situation to help protect myself but also not pay the most amount of fees? The best thing to do is to talk to an advisor and talk about estate planning. Estate planning is very, 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 very useful. And it's very important because at the end of the day, the only two things that are guaranteed in life are death and taxes. And one thing you have to do is prepare for that. If you don't prepare for death, it's going to catch you by surprise. If you don't prepare for taxes, the government's going to take more from you. So you got to make sure that you're preparing for both, because at the end of the day, it is inevitable. Those two things are going to happen, and you just want to make sure that you're in the best situation to cover all of those bases when it comes to things like this. So there you have it, guys. That's probate fees, the probate process, and everything you need to know about probate. If you like this video, please leave a like. Also, if you have any questions, leave those in the comments down below. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. If you learned anything from this video, please share it with your friends and family. At the end of the day, if you learned something from it, I'm sure they will too. And it also helps build my channel out so that I can continue making these videos for you guys to have this information readily available. As always, guys, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you guys in the next one.